Hello aviation fans, Sky here, and today we will leave the cozy civilian aviation and touch the military world. The world of fast and incredibly angry warbirds that delight friends at the air shows and upset enemies in war. We will not be going too far into the past and begin with the fourth generation. Our today's hero, being the father of this generation, is a very tough and very famous plane. Let's give him a proper welcome. The F-14 Tomcat is a jet fighter developed in the early 1970s by Grumman for the US Navy. Created using a number of new technical solutions based on the concepts and experiences of previous wars, the F-14 in principle is considered the first representative of the fourth generation fighters, as well as the first representative of the so-called Teen series, F-14, F-15, 16 and 18. Yeah, the school kids. At one time, the F-14 used to be on everyone's mind, although due to its specific nature, its distribution was quite modest. That is, if more than 700 units can be called modest. It is still in service, though not at home, but ironically in the Air Force of one of the main opponents of its homeland. Okay, let's fly into the past. The story of this handsome devil started with the problems that were kindly prepared for the American Navy by the Soviet Union. In the late 1950s, the development of missile and aviation technologies turned into a challenge for the sailors. Soviet bombers had the potential to carry out swift attacks, and the anti-ship missiles removed the need for them to fly close. The naval air defense systems could not fully solve this issue, and naval aviation, though remaining the main defense, could hardly guarantee security. The range and duration of patrols were modest, and the armament was no longer impressive. The fleet needed new fighters capable of meeting the requirements of the time, with more powerful weapons, radars, increased range and reliability. This need became obvious by 1961, when Robert McNamara became Minister of Defense in the John F. Kennedy administration. His problem was that planes were becoming more and more complicated and expensive. The Pentagon, trying to reduce the cost of creation and maintenance of new equipment, came to the conclusion that there was a need for deep unification, which means creating a single fighter, modifications of which will serve in both the Air Force and the Navy. As you can see, the ideas of the JSF program are growing from here. As a result, the Tactical Fighter Experimental, or TFX program, was initiated. In 1964 came the first flight of the newest F-111, which was to become the basis of future machines. But as usual, if you're trying to please everyone, you will not please anyone. The TFX concept was good from the point of view of development, production and maintenance, but the resulting aircraft did not meet the requirements of either the Air Force or the fleet. These requirements were often too different, and all the new solutions, even the breakthroughs, did not solve this problem. And while the F-111 was accepted by the Air Force, the sailors did not need their F-111B at all. The F-111B was aimed at the basic requirements of the fleet for the long-term patrolling of airspace around the Navy ship group, and it was quite capable of performing this task. But then, the reality of military operations showed that aerial combat is not always a beautiful duel at long distances, and in close quarters combat, this dangerous fighter would turn into a sitting duck. A new VFX program was initiated, the result of which was to become an aircraft close to the F-111B, but more adapted to naval aviation, and importantly, effective in a dogfight. The requirements were very ambitious. Naturally, such a project attracted all the big aviators: General Dynamics, Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, North American Rockwell and LTV, Ling Tecmo Vought. It is practically forgotten by now, but at one time it was a huge industrial conglomerate. The leaders were McDonnell Douglas and Grumman. But since Grumman was a member of the F-111 project, and the future VFX in a sense was based on it, it was decided to give the order to the company which already had the experience. It also didn't take long to invent the name for the aircraft. The main lobbyist of the program was Vice Admiral Thomas Connolly, who personally received permits and funding from Congress. Then, in the early 1960s, the name of the future aircraft was formed by combining the officer's name and Grumman's special passion of giving their planes cat names. And so, the name Tomcat appeared. The project was officially launched in 1969. The work was carried out at a very fast pace, and to accelerate mass production, the company significantly upgraded its main site on Long Island, next to New York. The fleet was rushing the company, while the sailors themselves were rushed by McNamara. They refused the TFX program, but still had to keep up with the deadlines. In fact, they skipped the stage of creating flying labs and immediately started building the aircraft they needed. Let's see what they created. So, the F-14 Tomcat. The fighter is made according to the layout of a variable sweep wing, 2-keeled vertical tail, and 2 engines located in the rear of the fuselage. With the takeoff mass of more than 30 tons, or 74,000 pounds, the F-14 became the heaviest fighter operating on American aircraft carriers. The fuselage of the aircraft is somewhat flattened, and its increased surface generates on average 40 to 60% of the lift force, depending on the mode of the wing. This percentage increases survivability, which was confirmed in practice. The F-14 got into serious trouble on several occasions and still made successful landings, being almost devoid of a wing or keel console. The wing of the aircraft has the ability to change its sweep, and the sweep can change automatically depending on the flight mode, including during a battle. The consoles can change angle from 20 to 68 degrees. The engineers were actively working on the wing during the tests. The plane even made landings on an aircraft carrier with maximum sweep, but the speed was too high and the pilots were strongly recommended against it. In addition, the aircraft performed flights with different sweeps of the console, while successfully maintaining control. A fairly large part of the wing remained stationary. It was done on purpose, so that there would be space for suspending equipment and weapons. On the F-111 there were rotary pylons directly on the consoles, but this practice did not pay off. It was heavy and not efficient aerodynamically. The tail unit consists of 2 large keels mounted above the engines, horizontal, fully turning stabilizers offset slightly below the wing plane, as well as 2 small keels under the engines. The power plant is represented by 2 Pratt & Whitney TF30 turbofan engines with afterburners. They were previously installed on the F-111, and Grumman neatly transferred them to the F-14. This power plant could accelerate the aircraft to a maximum speed of about Mach 2.3, and at the cruising modes it was quite economical, which was important for a patrol fighter interceptor. To increase flight time and range, the aircraft of course had the ability to perform aerial refueling. However, the TF-30 did not get a lot of love from the military. Their resource was very modest, and reliability. According to statistics, about 28% of all accidents with the F-14 were caused by the engines, with their constant failures, stalls, and fan breakdowns. Eventually, by the end of the 1970s, the F-14 underwent remotorization and received the new General Electric F-110. They were more reliable and efficient, and also unified with the similar engines already installed on the F-15 and F-16, which simplified maintenance. The engines are quite spread apart, which makes the fuselage larger and flatter. This allowed to deploy more onboard systems and fuel, as well as hang additional weapons below. In the rear part, there is a tailhook, catching cables of the arresting gear for active deceleration on the flight deck, as expected. The crew is seated in a tandem scheme, one behind another, under a single glazing of the canopy providing circular view. The aircraft was equipped with the most advanced onboard electronics of its time. The F-14 received a pulse Doppler radar, infrared sensors, a weapons control complex, and digital communication systems. The Central Air Data Computer, or CADC, became the basis of the onboard complex. Curiously, the CADC core can be considered one of the first full-fledged microprocessors. The creators of this computer, the Garrett Air Research Company, even prepared a lot of scientific publications, but working for the military has its drawbacks. All materials were classified and published only in the late 1990s, when no one cared. The main objective of the F-14 was to gain superiority in air, with the ability to protect a fairly large airspace over the Navy fleet groups and aircraft carriers. The main hammer of the F-14 was the newest AIM-54 Phoenix missile. With a mass of 450 kilograms, or over 1,000 pounds, it had the active radar guidance system and a firing range of 130 to 200 kilometers. The numbers differ. No one would give the real data, of course. It was this missile that was supposed to protect the fleet from Tu-16, Tu-22 and Tu-22M, the main potential enemy. However, unlike the F-111, the F-14 was able to intercept lighter targets, as well as conduct a dogfight. The aircraft received 8 suspension points and is capable of carrying up to 6.7 tons of weapons. Most often, in the 1970s and 1980s, the fighters were equipped with a set of 2 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles, 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders, and 3 AIM-7 Sparrows, plus the ammunition for the onboard Gatling cannon. Ironically, only a few Phoenix missile launches by the US Navy were documented over Iraq in 1999. Although, in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Iranians were using these missiles quite actively. The cost of all these features was the complete inability of the Tomcat to strike targets on the surface. The F-14 Tomcat prototype made its maiden flight in December 1970. Trials continued for several years, including aerial maneuvering, work on aircraft carriers, and firing tests. By 1973, the aircraft was officially certified by the military. In the US Navy, F-14 started deployment as full-fledged combat units in 1974, replacing the old F-4. The planes showed themselves pretty good, although problems with the TF-30 engines didn't take long to come out. There were many accidents at the beginning of operations. The first Tomcat combat took place in 1981 during the Gulf of Sidra incident, when 2 F-14s were engaged by 2 Su-22 jets of the Libyan Air Force. After that, the F-14 repeatedly participated in local clashes and large-scale military conflicts until the beginning of the 21st century, although they did not have to carry out their main task, intercepting Soviet aircraft and cruise missiles. The brightest year for most civilians in the history of F-14 was 1986, when these fighters went to the Top Gun flight school, where Tom Cruise and his friends were performing crazy stunts in the sky, playing volleyball, and winning battles with the MiG-28. Not a real plane, but the movie pretty awesome. The only country the F-14 was exported to was Iran. The Iranian Air Force needed a new generation of fighters capable of withstanding the new Soviet MiGs of the Iraqi Air Force. Iran made a big order for 80 fighters, as well as all the attached equipment and weapons, including 714 Phoenix missiles. Most of these weapons were delivered. However, after the Islamic Revolution, the contract was cancelled, and several vehicles did not reach the customer. Despite the stopping of support from Grumman, the Iranian F-14s continue to fly to this day. They took an active part in the Iran-Iraq War, with very conflicting statistics, of course. Also, it is not known exactly how many of them are in service by 2019, from several units to several dozens. The F-14s continue to take part in demonstration flights in Iran, and several times they accompanied the Russian bombers during the operations in Syria. The F-14 was, in fact, the first fourth-generation fighter, but created in the early 1970s, it had many crude solutions, although compensated by a significant modernization potential. The most popular model was, of course, the first one, F-14A. A group of 12 prototypes, YF-14A, was from this series, and the fleet received a total of 478 aircraft. Also, these aircraft were the ones delivered to Iran. In the late 1970s, the F-14 received new reconnaissance equipment and improved engines. In the next decade, they went through a deeper modernization. In 1987, the F-14A Plus fighter was created. It received the new F-110 GE400 engines and new avionics. If the index seems strange to you, do not be confused. In 1991, it was renamed into F-14B. The final and most advanced version was the F-14D Super Tomcat. It received the most advanced avionics, onboard computers, a glass cockpit, and the new AN APG-71 radar, in some ways close to a similar station of the F-15E Strike Eagle. The problem of the F-14 was its heavily specialized nature. As a fighter for gaining air superiority, it was good against enemy aircraft, but was not at all effective against targets on the ground. In the beginning, this was not critical, but with time, aviation was becoming more and more universal, and the Tomcat was not. Eventually, in the 1990s, after the retirement of the A-6 intruder attack aircraft, Grumman decided to handle this issue. The aircraft were equipped with various types of air bombs. It was assumed that they would be able to provide additional support for the F-A-18 in bombing operations. Nevertheless, this did not solve all the problems. In addition to its narrow specialization, the F-14 remained complex and very costly. At the time of its creation, it was the most expensive fighter in the United States history, the price of which was several times higher than that of the Phantoms, for example. Already at the initial stage, these factors prevented the aircraft from becoming a bestseller. They were interesting for the Marine Corps, but this interest quickly faded. They needed a simpler and more versatile attack aircraft, which later became the F/A-18. The Air Force, on the other hand, were never really looking at the F-14, developing their own programs, the result of which were the F-15 and F-16. In the beginning of the 21st century, it became clear that the F-14 is no longer relevant. Grumman initiated work to upgrade the plane, but this project was too complicated and expensive. The new versions of the F/A-18 were much more optimal to purchase. Technically, already by the end of the 1980s, the Pentagon was skeptical of this clearly obsolete fighter and was not making big orders for new aircraft, preferring to modernize the existing fleet. The new F-14D cost about $35 to $40 million. For 1991, it was way too expensive. The main weapon of the aircraft, the Phoenix missile, although it had unique performance, was crazy expensive too, and was hardly used in exercises, which called into question the effectiveness of its use by combat pilots. In the end, the multi-purpose F/A-18, created to complement the flagship, after several modernizations completely replaced it. The series production of the F-14 was closed in 1991, and it retired in the United States in 2006. A total of 712 jets were delivered. And this is the story of this glorious plane. Awesome, but not very long. And our today's video has also come to an end. Fast flights and soft landings to you.